Evening dreamers, lower the mask and rest easy. No one needs saving tonight. Tonight, we drift back through the real history of the most famous mutants in all of comics. Not the adventures themselves, but the true story behind them, how they were made, how they failed, and how they came back to become one of the biggest names in the entire business. Nothing tonight will ask anything of you. You don't need to remember any of it. You don't need to follow every turn. You can let every fact and every date drift past you like pages turning slowly in a quiet room. And that is exactly how this is meant to be heard. Slowly, gently, with no particular place to be. But here is the thing I want you to know before we begin, because it is the quiet secret of tonight. This is a true story. Every name in it was a real person. Every date is a real date. The writers, the artists, the editor who said no to the first title, the 5 years the book spent as good as dead, the single, strange, oversized comic that brought it back from the grave. All of it really happened, in real offices, in a real city, made by real people who mostly had no idea they were building something that would still be loved 60 years later. And there is something wonderfully soothing about a true story told softly in the dark, because you can simply sink into it and let it carry you, knowing that none of it is invention. It is history, the real history of how a forgotten little comic book became a legend. So before we drift into it, get comfortable. Turn the lights down low or off completely. Rest your head against something soft. And if you feel like it, before you drift too far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's a gentle thing we like to imagine, all the quiet rooms this voice travels into. A city apartment high above the traffic, a small house at the end of a long, dark road, a bed by a window somewhere with the rain coming down, or the snow, or the warm, still air of somewhere far away. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. And if these quiet histories help you find your way down into sleep, you're always welcome to follow along, so the light's still on tomorrow night, and the night after that. There's no rush at all. We have all the time in the world. Let's begin. Let's begin in the year 1963, softly, in the cramped and busy offices of a comic book company in New York City, because that is where it all started. And the way it started is stranger and funnier than most people know. At that time, a writer and editor named Stan Lee was on the single greatest creative run of his life. He was 40 years old, and he was doing the work of several people at once, serving as both the editor-in-chief and the head writer of the company. And in just the previous 2 years, working with a small group of astonishingly gifted artists, he had helped bring to life a whole galaxy of characters that people still know today. A famous family of 4 explorers changed by cosmic rays, a green giant born from a burst of radiation, a thunder god, a man in a suit of iron armor, a wall-crawling teenager bitten by a radioactive spider. One after another, in a mad burst of invention, all of them in cheap little 12-cent comic books, and the growing crowd of readers could not get enough of them. But here is where it gets interesting, and where the whole idea was born, softly, out of something very human: exhaustion. Because Stan Lee, having invented all of these heroes, had noticed a problem. Every single one of them needed an origin. Every single one needed some elaborate explanation for where the powers came from. This one was hit by cosmic rays. That one was caught in a gamma explosion. That one was bitten by a special spider. And Lee, sitting down to dream up yet another team of heroes, simply did not want to do it again. He did not want to invent one more freak accident, one more radioactive whatever, one more careful explanation for how ordinary people became extraordinary. He was tired of it. And so he did what he would later cheerfully admit was the lazy way out. He decided they would simply be born that way. Years later, Lee recalled the moment with total honesty. He said, and this is very close to his real words, that he couldn't have everybody bitten by a radioactive spider or exposed to a gamma ray explosion, so he took the cowardly way out. He said to himself, "Why don't I just say they're mutants? They were born that way." And that was it. That was the whole idea. Instead of an accident, a birth. Instead of an explanation, a simple fact of nature. These heroes would be a new kind of human, born different, carrying their powers from the very beginning, needing no story at all to explain them. It was a shortcut, born of tiredness, invented to save himself the trouble of writing one more origin. And it turned out to be one of the most powerful ideas in the entire history of the medium, though nobody, least of all Lee, had any idea of that yet. Because think, softly, about what that little shortcut accidentally created. If these heroes were simply born different, then they had been different their whole lives, which meant they had grown up different, which meant the world had watched them grow up and had seen them be different and had reacted to that difference. And suddenly, without anyone quite planning it, the whole idea had a shadow in it, a shadow that would become the deepest and most important thing about it. Because people, in the real world and in stories alike, do not always react kindly to those who are born different from themselves. And so a concept invented purely to save a writer some effort carried, hidden inside it from the very first day, the theme that would make it matter. The idea of being born different, in a world that fears what is different. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That shadow would take years to fully emerge. For now, in 1963, it was just a clever shortcut and a book that needed a name. Let's drift, now, into the naming of the thing, softly, because it is a lovely, small story, and it very nearly went another way entirely. Because Stan Lee did not originally want to call them the X-Men at all. His first choice, the name he actually wanted, was simple and direct. He wanted to call them the Mutants. That was the whole idea, so that was the name. The Mutants. But the company's publisher, a man named Martin Goodman, turned it down. And his reason, softly, is one of those little details that tells you so much about the world these comics were born into. Goodman worried that readers, especially younger readers, would not know what the word mutant even meant. It was too unusual, too scientific, too strange a word for a cheap comic book meant to fly off a spinner rack. It would confuse people. So the name was rejected, and Lee had to think again. And what he came up with, in the end, worked on two levels at once, which is why it stuck. He landed on the X-Men. The X, he explained, stood for extra. These were people with extra powers, an extra something ordinary humans did not have. But the X also pointed quietly at the man who would lead them, the professor at the heart of the team, whose name began with that same letter. So the name carried a double meaning, folded neatly together. Extra power and the mentor's name, both hidden inside a single letter. It is a small thing, but small things chosen well have a way of lasting, and that name has now lasted more than 60 years, all because a publisher thought a different word was too complicated. Now, into that name, the team had to be poured. And here we come to the artist, softly, because a comic is never made by a writer alone. The artist on that first issue was a man named Jack Kirby, one of the most staggeringly gifted and prolific artists the medium has ever produced. Kirby was a World War II veteran, a man who would sit at his drawing board with a cigar clamped in his teeth and produce pages at a rate that seems almost impossible, sometimes as many as 5 finished pages in a single day. And it was Kirby who took Lee's simple concept and gave it a face. Lee spent, by his own account, maybe a day writing the proposal and another day plotting the first issue. And Kirby, As he drew that first story, designed all the characters as he went, inventing their looks, their costumes, their whole visual identity, page by page at his drawing board. Let's drift through who they made, softly, because the original team was smaller and simpler than what most people picture today. There were 5 young heroes, teenagers really, dressed in matching blue and yellow uniforms. There was a young man who fired powerful beams of pure force from his eyes, unable to control them, forced to wear a special visor just to keep them contained. There was the youngest of the group, a cheerful boy who could turn himself to ice and freeze the world around him. There was a brilliant, athletic young genius with oversized hands and feet, a science prodigy who would later become one of the most beloved characters of them all. There was a wealthy young man, born with feathered wings growing from his back, who could fly. And there was a single young woman on the team, gifted with the powers of the mind, able to move objects with her thoughts, and later, to touch other minds. 5 teenagers, 5 differences, 1 team. And at the center of them, softly, the man the whole thing revolved around, their teacher, a powerful telepath, a man of the mind, who could read and touch and move through the thoughts of others, and who used a wheelchair, his body frail even as his mind was among the most powerful on earth. He had a dream, and the dream was the heart of everything. He dreamed of a world where those born different and ordinary humans could live together in peace. And to work toward that dream, he had taken his own family mansion, a great house in the wealthy countryside north of New York City, and quietly turned it into a school for young people born different, where they could learn to understand and control their gifts, and learn, too, to use them in the service of a world that did not yet trust them. A school that hid, behind its ordinary walls, the training of a team of young heroes. And every hero, of course, needs someone to stand against, softly. And here, from the very first issue, the storytellers did something quietly brilliant, though it would take years for its full power to show. Because the villain they created was not a monster, and not an alien, and not a madman bent on nothing but destruction. He was another one of the different ones, another person born with extraordinary power, exactly like the heroes. But where the professor dreamed of peace between the different and the ordinary, this other man had concluded something darker. He had decided that peace was impossible, that the ordinary world would always fear and hunt those born different, and that the only answer was for the different to rise up, to fight back, to rule rather than be ruled. He was the mirror of the professor. Same starting point, opposite conclusion. A man who wore a helmet to shield his mind, who could bend metal itself to his will, and who believed, with total conviction, that he was the only one willing to do what was necessary to protect his own kind. The hero and the villain, born of the same difference, divided only by hope. It was, from the very beginning, a far more interesting conflict than most comics ever attempted. And it was all there in that first issue in 1963. But here is the part of the story that almost nobody expects, softly, and it is the part that makes everything after it so remarkable. Because the X-Men, this team we now think of as one of the biggest names in all of comics, was not a success. Not at first. Not for a long time. In fact, for years, it was something close to a failure. Let's sit with that gently, because it is genuinely surprising. When people think of these characters now, they think of blockbuster films, of enormous fame, of one of the most valuable properties in the entire entertainment world. But in the 1960s, the comics simply did not catch fire the way the others had. The famous family of 4 had caught fire. The wall-crawling teenager had caught fire, becoming a sensation. But the team of young mutants, for all its clever ideas, sold modestly. It did fine. It did not soar. And in the world of cheap monthly comics, where sales were everything, and a book that did not sell well enough simply got canceled, Doing fine was a dangerous place to be. And then the situation got worse, softly, because the creators began to move on. The artist, Jack Kirby, the man who had designed the whole look of the team, left the book fairly early, moving on around the 17th issue. And Stan Lee, pulled in 1,000 directions as the head of the whole company, stopped writing it not long after, stepping away around the 19th issue. Lee himself later admitted, quite plainly, that the sales started to slip after Kirby left the book, and that at some point he stopped writing it too. The two people who had given the team its spark were both gone within the first 2 years, and a comic that was already only doing fine, now without its original creators, began to drift. For a while, other writers and artists tried to keep it going. Some of them were talented people who would go on to great things. Near the end of the decade, a new creative team came aboard and produced a stretch of issues that many fans, looking back, considered genuinely beautiful, some of the best-looking comics of their day. But it was too late. The audience had already drifted away. The sales had already fallen too far. And no amount of good work in the final stretch could undo the years of quiet decline that had come before. And so, softly, we come to the saddest moment in the whole history, the moment that makes the comeback so sweet. In the year 1970, the book was, for all practical purposes, cancelled. The final issue of Original Stories, the 66th issue, was published, and then the new stories simply stopped. The book did not vanish entirely from the shelves, but what happened to it was, in a way, worse than vanishing. It became a reprint book, which means that instead of telling new stories month after month, it simply reprinted old ones. The adventures from years before run again and again with no new material at all. For roughly 5 years, from 1970 onward, anyone who picked up an issue of this comic was reading a story they could have read years earlier. There was nothing new, nothing moving forward, just the old adventures, cycling around and around, like a heartbeat with nothing left to say. Let's rest a moment on how strange and quiet that is, softly, because it is such an unlikely place for a legend to be. Imagine it. One of the properties that would eventually become worth billions, that would fill cinemas around the world, that would be beloved by millions of people not yet born, was, for 5 long years, considered such a failure that it was not even worth writing new stories for. It was kept alive only in the cheapest possible way, reprinting the past, because someone at the company presumably felt it was not quite worth killing off completely, but certainly was not worth investing in. It was, in the truest sense, a forgotten book, dormant, sleeping, neither fully alive nor fully dead. And it stayed that way, quietly, year after year, while the world moved on and the great comic book boom of the 60s faded into the 70s. If the story had ended there, softly, no one today would remember the X-Men at all. They would be a footnote, one of the countless comic teams that came and went in the 1960s, an interesting failed experiment with a clever central idea, remembered only by the most dedicated historians of the medium. Everything the name means now, all the fame and all the love, would never have existed. The book was, to all appearances, finished. And that is exactly what makes what happened next one of the great comebacks in the whole history of popular storytelling. Because in 1975, someone decided to try again, and this time, everything would change. We have come a long way already, you and I. That is worth noticing, softly, before we go on. We started in a cramped office in 1963, with a tired writer inventing a shortcut, and we have drifted through the naming of the team, the artist who gave them their faces, the original 5, and then the long, slow, sad decline into failure and 5 silent years of reprints. If you are still here with me, drifting somewhere on the soft edge of sleep, there is no need to hold on to any of it. The dates will keep. What matters is the slow, warm current of the story in the dark, and that will carry you just fine whether you remember a single name or not. So let your grip loosen a little more, if it hasn't already. Sink a little deeper into the warm. We are about halfway along the road tonight, and the best part, the comeback, is still ahead. Let's carry on, slowly, together. Let's pause a moment, softly, before we reach the comeback, on just how easily it might never have come at all. Because there was nothing inevitable about the revival. The book had been reprinting its own past for 5 years. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for the company to simply let it fade away entirely, to quietly stop even the reprints, to let the team join the long list of forgotten 60s comics that no one ever thought about again. Publishing history is full of things exactly like that, promising ideas that failed and were set aside and simply never came back. That is the normal fate of a failed comic. Not a triumphant return, just silence, and then forgetting. And so the fact that someone, anyone, looked at that dormant, reprinting, 5 years cold book and thought there might still be something here, worth trying again, is itself a small, quiet miracle, worth resting on gently. It did not have to happen. No law of the universe required it. It happened because a particular person, at a particular moment, still believed in a thing that everyone else had written off. And that is so often how the things we love survive. Not through any grand inevitability, but through the quiet faith of one person who refuses to let a good idea stay buried. Everything that came after, all the fame, all the love, all of it, hung on that one slender thread. Someone, against all the evidence, still believed. Let's drift now into what that belief became. Let's drift now into the year 1975, softly, and into the single comic book that changed everything. Because after 5 years of reprints, someone at the company decided the Forgotten Team was worth one more try. The idea, by most accounts, came from the company's editor-in-chief at the time, a man named Roy Thomas, who had always liked the team and had written them years before. And he had an idea for how to bring them back. Not as 5 American teenagers this time, but as something the world of comics had never quite seen before. An international team. Heroes drawn from all around the world, from different countries and different cultures, brought together into a single group. And so the task of building this new team was handed to a writer named Len Wein and an artist named Dave Cockrum, and what they made became one of the most important single comic books ever published. It was an oversized special, a larger-than-usual issue, published in 1975, and it carried the first new story about this team in 5 long years. And into it, Wein and Cockrum poured a brand new lineup, a collection of heroes from across the globe that would go on to become some of the most beloved characters in all of comics. Let's drift through them, softly, because this new team is the one the world would come to love. There was a towering, powerful young man from Russia, gentle-hearted despite his strength, able to turn his entire body into living metal. There was a nimble, kind-souled hero from Germany, blue-skinned and acrobatic, able to vanish from one place and reappear in another. There was a proud hero from Ireland who could fly and unleash a devastating sonic scream. There was a fierce young warrior drawn from a Native American background. And there was a majestic woman from Africa, worshipped as a goddess for her power over the weather itself, able to call the wind and the rain and the lightning, who would become one of the most iconic and important characters the company ever published. Heroes from Russia, Germany, Ireland, Africa, and more gathered from around the world into a single team. It was a genuinely new idea, and it gave the book a scope and a richness it had never had before. And there was one more, softly. A short, gruff, fierce little man with metal claws and a bad temper, who had been introduced not long before in the pages of another comic, and who was folded into this new team almost as an afterthought. Nobody involved could possibly have guessed that this snarling, cigar-chewing side character would go on to become, arguably, the single most popular member of the entire team, one of the most famous comic book characters in the world. But that is getting ahead of the story. In 1975, he was just one more member of a promising new lineup, gruff and dangerous and easy to overlook. And here, softly, is a small and human detail that I love, because it shows how these things really get made. When the artist Dave Cockrum was asked to design the metal-bodied Russian hero, he later recalled that he simply went home and drew a strong guy, because the team needed a strong guy. The character's armor, he said, just kind of fell into place. He had originally drawn the hero with bare legs, thinking it only made sense, but the writer did not like male characters with bare legs, and so they worked out a small compromise about how the costume would look. That is how a beloved character, one who has now existed for 50 years, actually came to be. A man went home, drew a strong guy because the team needed one, and worked out a small disagreement about the costume. There was no grand plan. There was just craft and instinct, and two people solving a problem. And out of that ordinary afternoon came something that has lasted half a century. But a new team, however wonderful, was not quite enough on its own. Because the thing that truly turned this book from a promising revival into the biggest name in the business was not a character at all. It was a writer, and the way he arrived is one of the quietest and most charming details in the whole history. So let's drift into it softly. When Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were sitting in an office working out that first new story, they had, by several accounts, worked out almost everything, except they were stuck on the ending. And sitting just outside the office at that time was a young man working as an editorial assistant, doing the humble work of proofreading, checking pages for errors. His name was Chris Claremont, and by his own recollection, he would wander into the office where the two veterans were building the new team and ask if he could just listen. And they let him. And at some point, when they were stuck on that ending, it was, by some accounts, this young proofreader who helped them find their way out of it. That young man, that proofreader who wandered in to listen, would go on to write this book for the next 16 years. 16 years. Let's rest on that number a moment, softly, because it is almost unheard of. In an industry where writers typically stay on a book for a year or two before moving on, Chris Claremont took over the writing of the X-Men and stayed, more or less continuously, for the better part of 2 decades. And in those 16 years, he did something that very few writers in any medium ever get the chance to do. He built an entire world, slowly, patiently, thread by thread, and turned a recently failed comic into the single best-selling book in the industry. How did he do it? That is worth drifting into gently, because the answer is not what you might expect. He did not do it with bigger explosions or louder action. He did it with people. Claremont's great gift, the thing that set him apart, was that he treated his characters like real, complicated human beings. He gave them inner lives, private fears, slow-burning romances, old griefs, long grudges, quiet friendships. He let subplots simmer for months, even years, before they came to a boil. He wrote the team not as a collection of powers, but as a family, a messy, loving, quarreling, deeply human family, and readers came to care about them the way you care about people you actually know. He famously believed that stories should carry real risk, that if the good guys always won and nobody ever truly suffered, then the whole thing became weightless, like a game. He wanted his victories to be earned and his losses to hurt, because that was what made the reader truly care. And it worked, softly, more completely than anyone could have dreamed. Under Claremont, and under a series of brilliant artists who worked alongside him, the book caught fire in a way it never had in the 60s. It grew and grew and grew, until it was not just successful, but dominant. The book everyone was reading. The book that outsold everything else. The engine at the very center of the whole company. The Forgotten Failure. The book that had spent 5 years reprinting old stories because no one thought it worth new ones, had become the most popular comic in America. And it stayed that way, year after year, for a very long time. Let's rest a moment on the sheer unlikeliness of that, softly, because it is genuinely one of the great turnarounds in the history of popular art. A book invented as a shortcut. A book that failed for years. A book so unloved, it was left to reprint its own past. Revived on a hunch, handed by chance to a young proofreader who happened to be sitting outside the right office at the right moment. And then, through 16 years of patient, loving, human storytelling, transformed into a legend. There was no guarantee of any of it. At almost every step, it could easily have ended, quietly, forgotten. And instead, through a series of small human decisions and one extraordinary act of sustained creative devotion, it became one of the most beloved things in the entire medium. That is the story underneath all the powers and all the costumes. A story about a forgotten thing, brought back and loved into greatness. Let's drift, now, into the 2 most famous stories of that whole golden run, softly, not to retell them in detail, but to understand what they were and why they mattered so much. Because both of them came from the partnership between Claremont and a brilliant artist named John Byrne, and both of them are still spoken of, decades later, as among the greatest comics ever made. The first came in 1980, published across a run of issues, and it told the tragic story of one of the original 5, the young woman with the powers of the mind, as her abilities grew to a cosmic, almost godlike scale, and slowly, terribly, began to consume her. It was a story about power and corruption and love and loss, built on a scale that reached from a quiet mansion all the way out to the stars. And what made it legendary was its ending, which was genuinely tragic, genuinely painful, in a way that comics of that era rarely dared to be. Claremont believed, remember, that real stories needed real risk, that loss had to actually cost something, and this story paid that price fully. Readers were devastated. Some were even furious. The emotional impact was so great that it became, almost overnight, the story everyone pointed to as proof of just how powerful and how serious this medium could be. A Greek tragedy, some have called it, told in comic book form. It is still, to this day, regularly named among the greatest single stories the company ever published. And then, softly, came the second, published in 1981 across just 2 issues, and it may be the most influential comic of the entire run. It was a story about time and about a dark and terrible future. It imagined a world years ahead, a grim and broken future in which those born different had been hunted down, defeated, and herded into internment camps, while giant robotic hunters ruled over a ruined country. And it told the story of a desperate attempt from within that dark future to reach back into the past and prevent it from ever happening. Let's rest a moment on why that story struck so deeply, softly, because it reached beyond comics entirely. The images in it, of the different and the persecuted rounded up, marked, imprisoned in camps, deliberately echoed some of the darkest real history of the 20th century. It was not a comfortable adventure. It was a warning, a vision of where fear and hatred of the different could lead if it were allowed to run to its end. And that gave it a weight, a seriousness that stayed with people long after they put it down. It was so powerful an idea that it has been returned to again and again over the decades, retold and reimagined many times, and it eventually became the basis for one of the biggest films the franchise ever produced. 2 issues, just 2, and they cast a shadow that has stretched across more than 40 years. And this points us, softly, toward the deepest thing about these characters, the thing that separates them from almost every other team of heroes, and the thing we should drift into now as the night grows late. Because both of those legendary stories, in their different ways, were about the same thing. They were about what it means to be feared and hated for being different. And that theme, which had been hiding inside the concept from the very first day, from the moment a tired writer decided his heroes would simply be born that way, had by now grown into the beating heart of the whole thing. Let's drift, softly, into one of the most important creations to come out of those early years, because it gave the whole theme of persecution a face, a shape, something you could see and fear. In late 1965, still in those first couple of years of the book, the storytellers introduced a new kind of threat. Not another person born different, but something built by ordinary humans out of their fear. They introduced giant robots, towering mechanical hunters designed by a frightened human scientist for a single purpose: to seek out those born different and to capture them or destroy them. Let's rest a moment on the chilling brilliance of that idea, softly, because it is one of the most enduring in the whole mythology. The scientist who built them was not, in his own mind, a villain. He genuinely believed that those born different were a threat to ordinary humanity, that they would rise up and replace or destroy the normal people of the world, and that someone had to act to stop it. And so, out of fear, he built machines to hunt them. And here is the terrible irony that storytellers built into it right from the start. In one of those early stories, the great machines, following the cold logic of their programming, concluded that the only way to truly protect humanity from those born different was to rule over humanity themselves, to take control of everyone. The weapon built out of fear turned on the very people it was meant to protect. The scientist, horrified at what he had unleashed, ultimately gave his own life to try to stop it. There is a deep and lasting warning folded into that, softly, worth resting on gently. Because those towering hunting machines became one of the most important recurring threats in the whole history of these characters, returning again and again across the decades, and they always meant the same thing. They were fear itself, given metal form. They were what happens when a society decides that some group of people is dangerous simply for what they are, and builds machinery or laws or systems to hunt them. And the terrible lesson, told and retold, was always the same: that the machinery of fear, once built, does not stay under control. That hatred, once you build engines to serve it, turns in the end upon everyone. It was a remarkably serious idea for a comic book, and it gave the persecution at the heart of these stories a concrete, unforgettable shape. Fear, walking the earth on metal legs, hunting the different, and destroying, in the end, the very world it claimed to defend. Let's drift now into that theme itself, softly, because it is the reason these characters have meant so much to so many people, and the real history of how it developed is more interesting than the simple version most people know. The simple version goes like this. People often say that the team was created from the very beginning as a deliberate allegory for the civil rights movement, with the peaceful, dreaming professor standing in for one great real-life leader who preached nonviolence and integration, and the angry, militant villain standing in for another real-life figure who argued for more forceful means. It is a beautiful reading, and there is real truth in the parallel. The idea of a group hated and feared simply for being born different did resonate powerfully with the struggles for equality unfolding in the real world at exactly that time. The comic first appeared just after one of the most famous marches for civil rights in American history, and the professor, like a great real leader of that movement, quite literally had a dream of peace and equality. The parallel is there, and it is real, and it has given the characters enormous meaning for generations of readers who saw their own struggles reflected in them. But the true history, softly, is a little more complicated and a little more honest and worth resting on. Because according to the very people who made these comics, that clean allegory was not really the original plan. The artist John Byrne, who drew some of the most famous stories of all, has pointed out that anyone who actually reads the earliest issues will find a somewhat different template. In those first stories, he has argued, the dreaming professor reads less like a civil rights leader and more like a figure of hopeful mid-century American authority, while the villain, in his earliest appearances, was draped in the trappings of the great tyrants of the Second World War. The deep, deliberate civil rights allegory, by this telling, was not so much the founding blueprint as something that grew into the material over time, as later writers and readers found those meanings in it and drew them out. And this is where the long-serving writer Chris Claremont becomes so important again, softly, because it was largely he who deepened the whole thing into the rich moral fable we know today. And he did it, in part, out of his own real life. Because Claremont, as a young man, had spent time in Israel working on a communal farm, and there he had worked side by side on a daily basis with people who were actual survivors of the horrors of the Second World War. He watched military patrols pass by. He saw armed volunteers keeping watch through the night. And that experience, he later said, brought the great conflicts of the world home to him on a deeply personal level, in a way he had never expected. And he poured that understanding into the comic, softly, in one decision above all. He took the metal-bending villain, the mirror of the professor, and he gave him a past. He revealed that this man, this figure who believed the different could never live safely among the ordinary, who was willing to do terrible things to protect his own kind, had himself survived the greatest atrocity of the 20th century as a child. That he had watched, with his own eyes, an entire people be marked, hunted, and murdered simply for being what they were born as. And suddenly, softly, the villain was not a villain at all. Not really. He was a survivor, shaped by the worst thing human beings have ever done to one another, who had drawn from it the terrible lesson that it could happen again, and that he would die before he let it. You did not have to agree with him, but you understood him. You could even grieve for him, and a simple comic book bad guy became one of the most complex and tragic figures in all of popular fiction. Claremont himself, softly, was always thoughtful and a little humble about the great real-world parallels people drew. He acknowledged that the reading of the two leaders as stand-ins for two famous civil rights figures was completely valid and meaningful to many people. But he also said, honestly, that for him, as an immigrant, to have claimed that specific analogy directly would have felt presumptuous, like borrowing a struggle that was not his to borrow. He saw the villain, instead, through the lens of the history he had personally witnessed, as a figure who could evolve across a whole life, who could begin in darkness and struggle towards something else. And that honesty, that refusal to flatten the characters into a single, simple message, is a large part of why they have stayed so rich and so meaningful and so open to so many different people finding themselves inside the story. And there is one more piece of this, softly, the deepest and most tragic of all, and the storytellers deepened it beautifully over the years. It is the relationship between the dreaming professor and the metal-bending villain themselves. Because it was gradually revealed across the decades that these two men, the great hero and the great villain, the two poles of the whole story, had not always been enemies. Once, long ago, before the world knew mutants existed, they had been friends, close friends. The revelation, told in various ways over the years, placed their meeting in a setting heavy with meaning, the two of them working side by side in the aftermath of the 20th century's great horrors, helping to care for those who had survived unimaginable suffering. Two men who understood each other, two men who shared, at the start, the very same dream of a safe future for their own kind. And that is what makes their eventual split so tragic, softly, worth resting on gently. Because they did not fall out over some petty quarrel or some personal betrayal. They fell out over how. They wanted the same thing, a world where those born different could be safe. But one of them believed that safety could only come through peace, through patience, through building bridges and slowly earning the trust of a fearful world. And the other, shaped by having watched the very worst that fear and hatred can do, believed that trust was a fantasy, that the fearful world would never accept them, and that safety could only be seized by force. Same dream, opposite roads. And the tragedy is that each of them could see the truth in the other, could understand exactly why the other believed what he believed, and still could not agree, and so were driven by the deepest and most sincere of convictions to become enemies. Two friends who wanted the same beautiful thing, torn apart forever by their disagreement over how to reach it. There is something almost unbearably human in that, softly, worth carrying gently toward sleep. Because the deepest conflicts in the real world are so often exactly like this one. Not battles between good people and evil people, but battles between people who want the same good thing and cannot agree on how to reach it. People of sincere conviction, each able to understand the other, each unable to agree, each driven by genuine care into opposition. The professor and the villain are that oldest of tragedies, the friends divided not by hatred, but by conviction, each mourning the friendship they lost, each unable to cross the distance between them. And that lifted the whole story, once again, far above a simple tale of heroes and villains, into something that reaches the deepest truths of how people, even good people, even people who love each other, can be driven apart by the sincerest of beliefs. It is one of the great tragic relationships in all of popular fiction, and it grew, like everything else, out of that single quiet idea planted so long ago. Born different, feared for it, and divided in the end only by the question of what to do about a world that was afraid. Because that, in the end, softly, is the quiet genius of the whole thing. It began as a shortcut, a way to avoid writing origins. But because these heroes were born different and feared for it, the concept could hold almost any struggle a reader brought to it. Anyone who had ever felt different, ever felt like an outsider, ever felt feared or misunderstood for something they could not change about themselves, could look at these characters and see themselves. The metaphor was never locked to one single meaning. It was a mirror, wide enough to hold everyone who had ever felt like they did not belong. And that is why, out of all the hundreds of teams of heroes ever created, this one, this once forgotten failure came to mean so much to so many, not because of the powers, because of the difference and the being feared for it, and the dream held against all odds of a world where that fear might finally end. Let's drift now, softly, into what happened as the book climbed to the very top, because the story of these characters kept getting bigger, and the numbers involved became almost hard to believe. Through the 1980s, the book was the biggest comic franchise in America, spinning off new titles, new teams, new spin-offs, all growing out of that single, once-forgotten book. And then, in the year 1991, something happened that has never been matched to this day. The company launched a brand new companion series for the team, a second ongoing title to run alongside the first, written by the same long-serving writer and drawn by a young superstar artist whose bold, dynamic style was electrifying readers. And that first issue, simply titled with the team's name and the number 1, did something no comic had ever done before, and none has done since. It sold, softly, more than 8 million copies. Let's rest on that number a moment, because it is genuinely staggering. More than 8 million copies of a single issue of a single comic book. To this day, it holds the record, recognized officially as the best-selling comic book of all time. No comic before it had ever sold that many, and in all the decades since, none has come close. Now, part of that record came from a clever sales trick. The issue was released with several different covers, so that the most dedicated collectors bought multiple copies to get them all. But even accounting for that, the number is astonishing. The once-forgotten failure, the book left to reprint its own past for 5 silent years, had become the single best-selling comic book in the history of the medium. It is hard to imagine a more complete reversal of fortune. And at almost exactly the same time, softly, the characters broke out of comics altogether and into the wider world, where far more people would come to know them. Because right around the start of the 1990s, an animated television series began, bringing the team to Saturday mornings to children all over the world, many of whom had never held a comic in their lives. And that show, with its unforgettable theme music and its faithful, serious treatment of the characters and their struggles, introduced the team to a whole new generation and cemented the looks and the personalities of the core characters in the popular imagination. For millions of people, that cartoon, and not the comics, was where they first met these heroes, first learned their names, first came to love them. The characters had escaped the page. They belonged to everyone now. And then, softly, at the very end of the decade and the turn of the new century, came the final leap, the one that would make them famous on the largest scale of all. The team came to the cinema. A live-action film was released in the year 2000, treating the characters and their world with a seriousness that surprised many people who still thought of comic book heroes as silly children's fare. It was a success, and it helped to open the door for the enormous wave of superhero films that would come to dominate cinemas around the world in the decades that followed. More films followed, some of them beloved, exploring the characters, their pasts, their conflicts, their tragedies, on a scale of hundreds of millions of dollars, seen by people in nearly every country on Earth. And here is something worth resting on, softly, about just how big the whole thing grew, because it did not stay a single book for long. As the team became more and more popular through the 1980s, the company did the natural thing and began to build more books around it. First came a companion series about a team of younger students, the next generation coming up at the same school. Then a book reuniting the original 5 heroes from the 60s. Then a book following some of the heroes across the ocean to another country. Then a solo book for that gruff, clawed fan favorite. And on, until what had once been a single struggling title had become an entire line of interconnected comics, a whole family of books, all sharing the same world, the same characters, the same deep themes, feeding into one another, so that a devoted reader might be following 6 or 7 titles at once, all telling one enormous, sprawling, interconnected story. Let's rest a moment on how remarkable that is, softly, because it meant that this once forgotten book had become something more like a small industry, an engine at the very center of the whole company, generating title after title, each one supporting the others, the whole vast enterprise resting on that same simple foundation laid down by a tired writer in 1963. Interestingly, the long-serving writer and his editor were, by some accounts, not thrilled about all this expansion at first. They worried that spreading the characters across so many books might dilute what made them special, might spoil the unique magic of the thing. But the popularity was simply too great to contain, and the line grew whether they liked it or not. And that, too, tells you something about how these things go. A creation can become so beloved that it outgrows even the wishes of the people making it, taking on a life of its own, expanding to fill every space the audience's love creates for it. The book that had once been left to reprint its own past because no one wanted new stories, now could not produce new stories fast enough to satisfy the hunger for them. Let's rest a moment on the full arc of that, softly, because we can see the whole shape of it now, from end to end. A tired writer's shortcut in 1963, a modest comic that slipped into failure. 5 silent years of reprints, a book as good as dead. A hopeful revival in 1975, and a new international team. A young proofreader who wandered into the right office and stayed for 16 years, and loved the book into greatness. The best-selling comic of all time. A beloved cartoon. A wave of blockbuster films seen around the world. From a shortcut to a global phenomenon, across the better part of 60 years, carried forward the whole way by people who cared about it, one after another, each handing it on to the next. That is the real history. And almost none of it was ever guaranteed. Let's drift, softly, into a single phrase, before we ask the big question. Because over the decades, one line came to sum up the whole heart of these characters, so perfectly that it has been repeated countless times, in the comics, in the cartoons, on the screen. The phrase describes a team of heroes sworn to protect a world that hates and fears them. Let's rest on that phrase a while, softly, because it holds the entire paradox at the center of everything. A world that hates and fears them, and yet sworn to protect it. Think about what that really means. These are heroes who use their gifts again and again to save the very people who despise them, who risk their lives for a public that would round them up if it could, who protect the ordinary world not because that world is grateful, not because it loves them back, but simply because it is the right thing to do. They are feared and hated and hunted, and they choose, anyway, to be good. They choose, anyway, to protect. That is a far deeper and far more difficult kind of heroism than saving a world that cheers for you. And there is something quietly profound in that, worth resting on gently, because it speaks to one of the highest ideals a person can hold. To do good not for reward, not for gratitude, not for love in return, but simply because it is right, even toward those who would never do the same for you, even toward those who fear you and hate you and wish you gone. To meet hatred with protection, to meet fear with kindness, to be, quietly, better than the world that rejects you. That is the ideal at the very center of these characters, the thing that lifts them above a simple story of the persecuted fighting back. They do not seek revenge on the world that fears them. They protect it. And in that choice, in that refusal to let the world's hatred turn them hateful, lies something genuinely noble, something worth aspiring to, folded quietly inside a comic book about people with extraordinary powers. Let's drift, now, softly, into a gentle question, now that we have followed the whole long history from the cramped office to the cinema screen. Why did it last? Of all the hundreds and hundreds of teams of heroes invented over the decades, most of them long forgotten, why did this one, this once abandoned failure, survive and grow and come to mean so much to so many people? The answer is worth resting on as the night grows late, because it tells us something true, not just about comics, but about people. Part of the answer, softly, is simply the quality of the work, the patient human storytelling of that 16-year run, the care taken with each character, treating them as real people with real inner lives, the willingness to let stories carry genuine weight, genuine risk, genuine loss. Good work, done with love over a long time, has a way of enduring. That is part of it. But the deeper answer, softly, goes back to that accidental shortcut at the very beginning, and the shadow hidden inside it. Because these heroes were born different and feared for it, and that single idea turned out to be one of the most universal and most durable in all of storytelling. Everyone, at some point in their life, has felt different. Everyone has felt, at least once, like an outsider, like they did not quite belong, like there was something about them that others did not understand, or feared, or wished were otherwise. It is one of the most common feelings in the whole of human experience, and one of the loneliest. And here was a whole team of heroes built entirely around that feeling. Heroes who were feared and hated for what they were born as, who found each other, who built a family out of their shared difference, who chose, despite everything, to protect a world that did not even want them. Is it any wonder, softly, that so many people saw themselves in that? Whatever it was that made a reader feel different, feel like an outsider, feel afraid of being truly seen, they could look at these characters and find it reflected back at them, transformed into something heroic and beautiful. The difference that made them feel alone became, in the story, the very thing that made the heroes special. The isolation became a family. The fear became courage. And the dream at the center of it all, the professor's dream of a world where the different and the ordinary might finally live together in peace, was a dream that spoke to anyone who had ever longed simply to be accepted for what they were. That is why it lasted, not because of the powers, because of the feeling underneath the powers, which was one of the truest and most universal feelings there is. And there is one more thing worth resting on, softly, as we begin to draw toward the end of our night. It is the sheer human chain of it all. Because this thing was never made by one person, it was made by a long line of people, each picking it up and carrying it a little further. The tired writer who invented the shortcut, the prolific artist who gave them their faces, the editor who had a hunch it was worth reviving, the writer and artist who built the new international team, the young proofreader who wandered into the right office and gave 16 years of his life to it, the artists who drew it, the later writers who deepened it, the animators who brought it to television, the filmmakers who brought it to the cinema. Hundreds of people across 60 years, each one adding something, each one handing it on to the next. No single one of them made the thing we know today. They made it together in a great relay across the decades, most of them never meeting, each simply doing their part and passing it along. There is something quietly beautiful in that, softly, worth carrying gently toward sleep. The way the things we love are so often not the work of a single genius, but the accumulated work of many hands across many years, each adding a little, each passing it on. A great cathedral built by generations of craftspeople, most of whose names are forgotten. A story built by a long line of storytellers, each loving it enough to carry it a little further before handing it on. That is how this once-forgotten comic became a legend, not through any single act, but through 60 years of people caring about it, one after another, and refusing to let it be forgotten. And there is a deep comfort in that thought, a warm one, to rest on as you drift. That the things worth loving are carried forward by many hands, that nothing truly loved is ever really left to die, that there is always, somewhere, someone willing to pick it up again and carry it on. Let's drift back now, softly, to that first legendary story, the tragic one about the young woman whose powers grew to cosmic scale, because there is a piece of true behind-the-scenes history there that almost nobody knew for years, and it is one of the most fascinating things in the whole tale. It is the story of how that legendary tragic ending very nearly did not happen at all. Because here is the secret, softly. The writer and the artist did not originally plan for that story to end in tragedy. Their original plan was much gentler. In the version they first intended, the young woman, having been overtaken by a cosmic force beyond her control, would simply have her powers stripped away by alien science and then be returned, alive and safe, to her friends and her life. She would live. The story would move on. That was the plan. That was the ending they had drawn and lettered and prepared, all ready to be sent to the printers. But then, softly, the company's editor-in-chief at the time, a famously demanding man, picked up the nearly finished pages and read them. And as he read, he grew troubled. Because in the course of the story, while overtaken by that cosmic power, the young woman had done something monstrous. In a moment of terrible, thoughtless power, she had destroyed an entire inhabited world, wiping out billions of living beings. And the editor felt, reading the gentle, planned ending, that it simply did not work, that it was, in his words, a cop-out. He did not believe that a character could commit an atrocity on that unimaginable scale and then simply be depowered and welcomed home as though nothing had happened. The price was not high enough. The scales did not balance. He compared it, pointedly, to letting one of history's great monsters off with nothing more than having his army taken away. And so, softly, a fierce behind-the-scenes disagreement unfolded, of exactly the kind that shapes so much great art without the audience ever knowing. The editor insisted the ending had to change, that the character had to truly face the weight of what she had done. The writer and artist, backed into a corner, faced with rewriting the climax of the biggest story they had ever told, made a fateful choice. If she could not simply walk away, then she would face the ultimate price. In the new ending, the young woman, feeling the terrible cosmic power beginning to rise within her once again and refusing to let it hurt anyone else ever again, would choose to sacrifice herself. She would die, by her own choice, as a human being, rather than live to become a destroyer. It was a genuine tragedy, chosen freely, a triumph of a person's humanity over infinite and corrupting power. And here is the beautiful irony, softly. That ending, forced into being by an editorial argument, born from a last-minute conflict, turned out to be the very thing that made the story immortal. The writer himself later reflected that the death gave them something no other book had: real credibility, real stakes. They had killed off a major, beloved, founding character, and they had said, in effect, that it was real, that it counted, that it would not simply be undone. And that realness, that willingness to let a story truly hurt, separated this book from nearly everything else on the shelves. Readers understood, from that moment on, that in these pages anything could happen, that no one was truly safe, that the stories carried genuine weight. The gentle, planned ending would have been forgotten. The tragic, forced ending became one of the most famous moments in the history of the medium. The disagreement made the masterpiece. That is so often how it goes, softly, with the things we love. The friction, the conflict, the pulling in different directions, is the very thing that strikes the spark. And let's drift, softly, toward one more piece of this, because it connects to that gruff little side character we mentioned earlier, the short, fierce one with the metal claws who had been folded into the team almost as an afterthought. Because something remarkable happened to him over those years. Readers loved him. Something about him, his danger, his mystery, his wounded heart hidden under all that ferocity, caught the imagination of the audience in a way nobody had expected. And slowly, the storytellers gave him more and more room. In the early 1980s, he was given his own solo story, a self-contained tale that took him far away to another country and explored his struggle between his savage, animal nature and a deeper longing for honor and control. And that story deepened him enormously, turning the one-note side character into someone with real depth, real conflict, real soul. And from there, softly, he simply kept rising, until he had become, against all the odds, the single most popular member of the entire team, one of the most famous comic book characters in the entire world. The afterthought became the star. The character nobody planned for became the face of the whole franchise for millions of people. And there is something wonderful in that, worth resting on gently. The way the things that end up mattering most are so often the ones nobody planned. The side character who steals the show, the small idea that grows into the biggest one, the afterthought that becomes the star. Nobody sat down and decided he would be the most beloved of them all. The readers decided, slowly, over years, by loving him. And the storytellers, wise enough to listen, followed that love and gave him room to grow. That is the other quiet lesson in all of this, that you cannot always plan what will matter. Sometimes you simply have to make many things with care and pay attention to which ones people take into their hearts, and then have the wisdom to follow. Let's drift, now, softly, into another quiet piece of what made that long golden run so special, because it is easy to miss, and it mattered enormously. It is the way the storytellers built a door for the reader to walk through. Because right around the start of the 1980s, in the same stretch of issues as that legendary tragic story, the writer and artist introduced a brand new character, and she was different from everyone around her, on purpose. She was young, only 13 years old when she arrived, the youngest member of the whole team by far, a bright, ordinary girl suddenly swept up into a world of adult heroes and cosmic dangers. And that was exactly the point of her, because everyone around her, by this time, was a seasoned hero, experienced, powerful, sometimes frightening. And into that world of adults walked a kid, wide-eyed, seeing it all for the first time, exactly as a new reader would. She became, in the language of storytelling, the audience's own eyes. The reader was reintroduced to the whole team through her, meeting these heroes freshly through the gaze of a young newcomer who was as new to it all as you were. She did not see the frightening monster in the blue-skinned hero. She did not see the dangerous animal in the fierce clawed one. She just saw people and wonder and a world opening up in front of her. There is real craft in that, softly, worth resting on. Because a world as rich and long-running as this one can become intimidating to newcomers. So many characters, so much history, so many years of story. And one of the wisest things storytellers can do is provide a way in. A single ordinary figure through whose eyes a newcomer can enter. Someone who is also seeing it all for the first time. Asking the questions the reader would ask. Feeling the wonder the reader would feel. This young character did exactly that. She was the reader's friend inside the story. The kid who did not know everything yet. The one you could stand beside as the vast, strange world revealed itself. And readers loved her for it. So much so that when the storytellers later put her through heartbreak, some fans reacted with genuine fury. So invested had they become in this one young character's happiness. That is how completely she had become their way into the story. Their own younger self, walking wide-eyed into a world of wonders. And this points towards something larger, softly, that set this book apart in its era. Something genuinely ahead of its time. Because the long-serving writer became known, above almost anything else, for writing women. Real women. Complicated, powerful, fully realized women, at a time when comics very often did not. Across his long run, he built a whole roster of female characters who were not decorations, not damsels, not afterthoughts, but leaders, warriors, geniuses, souls in full. The weather goddess from Africa who became one of the most regal and powerful figures in the whole company. The young newcomer we just spoke of, and many more after them, each one distinct, each one real. He gave the book a richness and a balance that was genuinely rare for its time, and in doing so, he opened the door for countless readers, especially young women, who had rarely seen themselves reflected as true heroes in these pages, to finally find someone who looked and felt like them at the very center of the story. Let's rest a moment on how much that would have meant, softly, to the people who felt it. Imagine being young and reading comics, and rarely, if ever, seeing yourself as the hero, only ever at the edges, only ever as someone to be rescued. And then imagine opening this book and finding a whole team full of people like you, at the center, leading, fighting, mattering, real. That is a quiet kind of gift, the gift of being seen, of being told, through a story, that you too can be the hero, that you too belong at the center. And it flows straight from that same deep well as everything else in this history, the well of difference and belonging, and the longing to be seen for what you truly are. The book that was built around people born different became, in the hands of a writer who cared, a book that made room for everyone. And that, too, is part of why it lasted, and why it was loved, and why it still is. Let's drift, softly, into just how serious this once humble comic became willing to be, because it is a remarkable thing, and easy to forget. Over the years, especially in the hands of that long-serving writer, the book took on themes that most people would never expect a superhero comic to touch. It looked, directly and unflinchingly, at prejudice, at bigotry, at the way fear of the different can curdle into hatred, and hatred into violence. It told stories in which those born different were the targets of hate movements, of preachers who whipped up crowds against them, of ordinary people taught to see them as less than human, as a threat to be eliminated. It did not look away from any of it. It held the ugliness of real prejudice up to the light and asked its readers, many of them young, to look at it clearly and to feel, through these fictional heroes, what it is like to be hated for something you did not choose and cannot change. There is something genuinely brave in that, softly, worth resting on. Because this was, remember, a commercial product, a monthly comic book meant to sell to children and teenagers, it would have been so easy to keep it light, to keep it safe, to give the readers nothing but colorful battles and happy endings. And instead, the storytellers trusted their audience with something harder and truer. They used the safe distance of fantasy, of people with impossible powers, to talk about the most real and most painful things, about what it feels like to be an outsider, about the cruelty of crowds, about the courage it takes to hold on to your dignity, and even your compassion in the face of a world that has decided to hate you. And because it was wrapped in the color and excitement of a superhero story, it could reach young readers in a way a lecture never could, and plant in them, quietly, a deep and lasting empathy for anyone who has ever been treated as other. Let's rest a moment on the gift of that, softly, because it is a real one. Countless people have said, over the years, that these stories were where they first learned, really learned, in their bones, to feel for the outsider. That a comic about mutants taught them, as children, something true about prejudice in the real world, something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives and made them kinder and more understanding and quicker to stand with the hated and the excluded. That is an extraordinary thing for a comic book to do. It took a shortcut invented to save a tired writer some trouble, and it grew, over the decades, into one of the most humane and empathy-building stories in all of popular culture. A story that used impossible powers to teach a very possible, very human lesson. That the different are not to be feared. That the outsider is a person, exactly as real as you. And that the measure of a society is how it treats the ones it is tempted to hate. Let's drift now, softly, into one of the gentlest and warmest ideas at the heart of the whole thing, one that suits the late hour perfectly. It is the idea of the school. Because at the very center of this entire concept, from the first issue all the way to the present day, sits not a fortress, not a base, not a headquarters, but a school. A great old house in the quiet countryside turned into a place of learning, where young people who had nowhere else to go could come and be safe and be understood. Think about how unusual that is, softly, for a team of heroes. Most great hero teams gather in some grand fortress or secret headquarters, a place built for launching missions and storing equipment. But at the heart of these heroes was a home, a house with bedrooms and a kitchen and grounds to walk in. A place where frightened young people, newly discovering that they were different in ways that made the world afraid of them, could arrive, often having been rejected by their own families, sometimes having run away, sometimes having been driven out, and find, at last, a place where they belonged. Where the very thing that had made them outcasts everywhere else was simply normal. Where they were not freaks or dangers or things to be feared, but just young people, learning, among others like them. There is something so tender in that, softly, worth resting on as the night grows deep, because it speaks to one of the deepest longings there is, the longing for a place where you are safe to be exactly what you are. So many of us spend so much of our lives feeling that we have to hide some part of ourselves, to soften it, to keep it out of sight, for fear of how others might react. And the dream of a place where that hiding could finally stop, where you could set the whole weight of it down and simply be yourself among people who understood, is one of the most beautiful dreams there is. The school at the heart of this story is that dream, given form. A refuge, a home for the ones who had no home, a place where the different could finally, safely belong. And the man who built it, softly, the professor in his wheelchair, was at heart not a general, but a teacher. That is worth resting on too. His great weapon was never really his considerable power. It was his belief in young people. His faith that if he could just gather these frightened, gifted, rejected children and give them a safe place and help them understand themselves and show them they were not alone, then they could grow into something extraordinary and could help build the very world of peace he dreamed of. He was a teacher who believed in his students completely, who took in the lost and the frightened and saw in them not danger, but promise. And there is something quietly moving in the thought of that, of a story whose central hero is, above all, a teacher who believes in the children the world has given up on. And out of that school, softly, grew the deepest theme of all, the one that the found family made real. Because these young people, gathered together in their refuge, became something more than classmates and more than teammates. They became a family. Not a family of blood, most of them had been rejected by those, but a family of choice, of understanding, of shared difference. They fought, and they loved, and they grieved, and they grew up together, and they held each other through everything the frightened world threw at them. And that idea, of a family you build rather than a family you are born into, a family of people who understand you because they have suffered as you have suffered, is one of the most powerful and most beloved ideas in all of storytelling, because so many people in the real world know exactly what it means. To be let down by the family you were born into, and to find, somewhere out in the world, among others who understand, the family you were always meant to have. The school gave these heroes that, and through them, it gave it to millions of readers too, the warm and healing dream of a place to belong, and a family that chooses you and accepts you exactly as you are. And here is a lovely thing to rest on, softly, as we begin to draw toward the end of our night, because it shows that this story is not finished, not even close. That beloved animated series from the 1990s, the one that introduced the team to a whole generation on Saturday mornings, ran for 76 episodes, and then, long ago, ended. And for more than a quarter of a century, that was that. A cherished memory, a piece of many people's childhoods, but firmly in the past. And then, softly, in the year 2024, nearly 3 decades later, it came back. A continuation of that very same 1990s cartoon was released, picking up almost exactly where the old one had left off, bringing back many of the original voice actors, the same theme music, the same beloved style, updated for a new age. And it was not a quiet, nostalgic footnote. It was a genuine phenomenon, met with widespread acclaim, watched by millions, celebrated as one of the best things the studio had produced in years. The children who had grown up with the original show, now adults, watched it alongside their own children, 2 generations meeting in the same story. The revival was so successful that more of it was ordered almost immediately, and the mutants found themselves once again at the very center of the culture, beloved as much as they had ever been. Let's rest a moment on what that means, softly, because it completes the whole long arc in the most beautiful way. This is a story, remember, that began as a shortcut, that failed, that spent 5 years as good as dead, reprinting its own past because no one thought it worth new stories. And here it is, more than 60 years later, not merely surviving, but thriving, coming back in triumph, beloved by generation after generation, each one passing it down to the next. The forgotten book did not just survive, it became one of the most enduring and beloved creations in all of popular culture, a thing that parents now share with their children, that keeps being reborn again and again for each new age that discovers it. Let's gather the whole story together now, softly, one last time, as sleep draws very near, because we have traveled the full length of it tonight. It began in 1963, with a tired writer who did not want to invent one more origin, and who reached, almost lazily, for a single powerful idea: Born Different. It nearly got a different name entirely, until a nervous publisher stepped in. A brilliant artist gave the team their faces, and then, despite it all, the book failed and slipped into 5 silent years of reprints. It was revived in 1975 with a bold new international team. A young proofreader wandered into the right office and stayed for 16 years, loving the book into greatness, treating its characters as real people, giving them a found family and a school to call home. Legendary stories were made, some of them shaped by fierce arguments behind the scenes that turned out to make them immortal. An afterthought of a side character rose to become the most beloved of them all. The book became the best-selling comic in history. A cartoon carried the characters around the world. Films made them famous on the largest scale of all. And decades later, they came back, again and again, beloved as ever, passed down from parents to children, still alive, still growing, still loved. And underneath all of it, from the very first day to this one, a single, quiet idea. The idea of being born different, in a world that fears what is different, and the dream, held against all odds, of a place where that fear might finally end. A dream of belonging. A dream of a family that chooses you. A dream of a home where you can finally, safely, be exactly what you are. That is what a tired writer accidentally reached for all those years ago. And that is why, out of all the countless heroes ever created, these once forgotten mutants, came to be loved by so many. Because the dream at the heart of them is a dream that lives, quietly, in almost every human heart. The dream of being accepted. The dream of belonging. The dream of finally being seen and understood and loved for exactly what you are. So let the whole long story go now, softly, and let yourself drift the rest of the way down into sleep. The great old house sits quietly in the countryside, its windows warm against the dark, full of young people who have finally found a place to belong. The dream still holds. The story still unspools in comics and cartoons and films, in the hands of new storytellers who love it as much as the old ones did, carried forward, as it always has been, by many hands across the years. And whatever made you feel different, whatever ever made you feel like an outsider, know softly as you drift that there is nothing wrong with being what you are. That difference has always been where the heroes come from. You are safe. The house is warm. No one needs saving tonight, least of all you. You are allowed to let go. Sleep well, dreamer. The lights in the great old house are still glowing softly in the dark. The dream is still being dreamed. The story will keep unspooling, quietly, whether you are awake to follow it or not, and that is exactly as it should be. And whenever you are ready, on whatever quiet night you find your way back here, we will drift through another story together, softly, in the dark. There is no hurry at all. There never is. Rest now. You are safe. Sleep well.